Story number 1. The Rest Stop. Driving through the back roads of Texas at night can be an oddly calming experience. There's something hypnotic about the endless stretch of asphalt, the rhythm of tires humming on the road, and the occasional glow of distant headlights breaking through the oppressive darkness. For years, I had taken solace in these late-night drives, finding peace in the solitude that the open road offered. But one night, somewhere along Route 56, I discovered a kind of solitude that no one should ever have to endure. I had been driving for hours, the monotony of the road starting to wear me down. The coffee I'd picked up at a gas station 2 towns back had long since gone cold, and my eyelids felt heavier with each passing mile. The plan was simple: get to my cousin's place in Amarillo by dawn, crash on his couch, and start fresh the next day. But fatigue has a way of making you question your decisions. By the time I saw the sign for a rest stop a few miles ahead, I decided it was time for a quick break. The rest stop appeared suddenly, its small building bathed in the flickering glow of a single fluorescent light. A few vending machines stood in a row near the entrance, their neon colors adding a strange vibrancy to the otherwise desolate scene. The parking lot was empty, and there was no sign of other travelers. That wasn't unusual; these stops were often deserted late at night. I figured I'd grab some water, stretch my legs, and get back on the road. Pulling into the lot, I parked close to the entrance and stepped out into the cold night air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the vending machines and the crunch of gravel under my boots. As I approached the door, I noticed something strange. The building seemed too pristine for such an isolated location. The windows were spotless, the tiles inside gleaming under the harsh light, and the vending machines looked brand new. It was almost unnerving in its perfection. The door opened with a soft creak, and I stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of cleaning chemicals, but it was warm, too warm for a place like this. A few plastic tables and chairs were arranged neatly near the windows, and a water cooler sat in the corner. I grabbed a bottle of water from one of the vending machines, paid with a crumpled dollar bill, and took a seat by the window. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax. The water was cold and refreshing, and the chair, though plastic and uncomfortable, offered a brief reprieve from the stiff confines of my car. I leaned back, staring out at the empty parking lot. The darkness beyond the flickering light felt impenetrable, as if the rest stop existed in a bubble, cut off from the rest of the world. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. They were soft at first, like someone trying to sneak through the tiled room without being noticed. I froze, the bottle of water halfway to my lips, and strained to listen. The steps grew louder, more deliberate, echoing against the walls of the empty rest stop. My eyes darted toward the entrance, expecting to see another traveler or perhaps a worker emerging from some hidden backroom. But the door was closed, and the room was as empty as when I had arrived. A cold knot of fear began to form in my stomach. "Hello?" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. The sound echoed through the room, but there was no response, only the continuing footsteps, now circling the tables and chairs as if someone were pacing just out of sight. I stood up, my body tense, and turned toward the noise. "Is someone there?" My voice wavered, betraying the fear I was trying to suppress. The footsteps stopped abruptly, the silence rushing in like a tidal wave. For a moment, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. Then I heard it, soft breathing, coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been when I walked in. My eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, but nothing moved. The breathing had stopped, replaced by an almost oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I decided it was time to leave. Grabbing my bottle of water, I turned toward the door. But as I did, something caught my eye, a face, pale and distorted, pressed against the glass of the window nearest the entrance. Its features were grotesque, twisted into an unnatural grimace that sent a bolt of terror through me. The eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to lock onto mine, as if the thing behind the glass could see straight into my soul. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over one of the chairs, and the face vanished. I stood frozen, staring at the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The glass was clear again, reflecting only the flickering light of the rest stop. But the image of that face was burned into my mind, its hideous grin and hollow eyes refusing to fade. Shaking, I grabbed my things and bolted for the door. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to my car and away from whatever was inside that building. As I reached for the car door, I hesitated, my eyes drawn to the window of the rest stop. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows just beyond the light. Then it was gone. I climbed into the car and started the engine, the familiar rumble of the motor a welcome sound. But as I reached for the gear shift, I froze. In the rearview mirror, I saw something, or someone, sitting in the back seat. It was a shadow, vaguely humanoid, its form barely discernible in the dim light. My heart stopped as I realized it was leaning forward, its face inches from mine, though I couldn't make out its features. "Don't look back," it whispered, the voice low and guttural, sending shivers down my spine. I didn't hesitate. Slamming the car into drive, I hit the gas, my tires spinning briefly on the icy pavement before catching traction. I sped out of the rest stop, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The thing in the back seat didn't move, didn't make another sound, but I could feel its presence, a cold, suffocating weight pressing down on me. I drove for miles, the dark highway stretching endlessly before me. The rest stop was long gone, but the shadow lingered, its silent presence a constant reminder of the horror I had just experienced. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to glance at the rearview mirror, afraid of what I might see. When I finally reached a gas station on the outskirts of Amarillo, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon, I pulled into the lot and stumbled out of the car. My legs felt weak, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I looked back at the Subaru, half expecting to see the shadow still inside. But the back seat was empty, the car's interior bathed in the soft light of morning. I never stopped at another rest stop after that night. The memory of that face in the window, the footsteps, and the whispered warning haunted me for years. I don't know what I encountered at that desolate place, but I'm certain it wasn't human. Whatever it was, it wanted me to leave, and I've never been more grateful to have listened. Story number 2. The Static Melody. Driving long-haul routes at night had always been my kind of job. There was something comforting about the steady hum of the engine, the stretch of open road illuminated by headlights, and the solitude that came with knowing it was just me and my truck cutting through the darkness. But one night on the outskirts of Nevada, that solitude turned into something I'll never forget. I was hauling a load of refrigerated goods to a warehouse in Reno, the truck's cabin a familiar cocoon against the cold, desolate stretch of highway. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m., and the airwaves on the radio were silent, just the occasional crackle of static when I fiddled with the dials. Normally, I'd have it playing my favorite classic rock station, but out here, signal was spotty at best, so I had turned it off an hour ago. The highway was empty, the landscape outside a barren expanse of shadows. I hadn't seen another car in over 30 minutes, and the only company I had was the occasional howl of the wind brushing against the cab. I reached for my thermos, taking a sip of lukewarm coffee to keep myself alert. That's when it happened. The radio clicked on by itself. At first, I thought I might have bumped the knob by accident, but my hand was nowhere near the dashboard. The soft hiss of static filled the cabin, low and rhythmic like a heartbeat. I glanced at the controls, confused. The display didn't show a station, just a faint flicker of numbers that didn't seem to settle on anything legible. The volume knob twisted slightly on its own, the static growing louder, almost deliberate. "Damn it," I muttered, reaching to turn it off. But before my hand could make contact, a song broke through the static. It was faint, distorted, and oddly familiar, a melody I couldn't quite place, like an old nursery rhyme played on a warped vinyl record. The sound was layered with strange, echoing noises, the faint chatter of children's voices, laughter, and something darker beneath it all, like a whisper I couldn't understand. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My truck had seen its fair share of electrical glitches over the years, but this was different. The song continued, looping in a way that felt unnatural. The children's voices grew louder, their laughter sharp and piercing. "They never leave," a child's voice said, clear as day. I slammed the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the frosty pavement before coming to a stop. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat there, gripping the wheel tightly, staring at the radio display. The voices faded back into the melody, now warped and sinister, like something out of a nightmare. I reached for the volume knob, determined to shut it off, but it wouldn't budge. The radio crackled again, and this time, the laughter turned into a sharp, shrill scream. My breath caught in my throat as the scream abruptly cut off, replaced by silence. The display flickered once more, and the words "they never leave" appeared briefly on the screen before the radio shut itself off. I sat there in stunned silence, the hum of the truck's engine the only sound in the oppressive stillness. My hands trembled as I unbuckled my seatbelt and opened the door. The cold night air hit me like a slap, clearing my head just enough to think straight. I stepped out of the cab, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots grounding me in reality. The highway was dead silent, the kind of quiet that presses down on you like a physical weight. I walked around to the front of the truck, checking the hood and the tires, anything to distract myself from the unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. Everything looked fine, no sign of electrical issues or anything out of place. As I turned to head back to the cab, a flicker of movement caught my eye. In the distance, near the edge of the highway, I saw someone. A small figure standing just beyond the reach of my headlights, their form blurry in the swirling fog. I froze, my breath visible in the cold air. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing into the emptiness. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still, watching me. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if I was being pulled into something I couldn't understand. Before I could call out again, the figure took a step forward, and I saw it clearly, a child, no older than 8 or 9, their face pale and expressionless. "Leave," the child said, their voice barely louder than a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a blade. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing on the gravel. The child didn't move, but their presence felt suffocating, as if the air around them was charged with something unnatural. My instinct screamed at me to get back in the truck and drive, but my body felt rooted to the spot. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the child was gone. The silence returned, heavier than before, and I forced myself to move, scrambling back into the cab and locking the doors behind me. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my eyes darting to the radio. It remained off, the display dark and lifeless. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life, its familiar sound a small comfort against the terror I had just experienced. I pressed the gas pedal hard, the truck lurching forward as I sped down the highway. The headlights cut through the fog, revealing nothing but the endless stretch of road ahead. My pulse began to slow as the miles ticked by, but the memory of the child's face lingered, etched into my mind like a scar. Just as I started to feel some semblance of calm, the radio clicked on again. This time, the static was louder, more erratic, like a swarm of bees trapped inside the speakers. The nursery rhyme returned, its melody distorted and twisted, and the children's voices began to chant in unison. "They never leave. They never leave. They never leave." The words looped over and over, the voices growing louder, more insistent. I slammed my fist against the dashboard, shouting, "Stop it. Just stop." The radio fell silent. For a brief moment, the only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then, the child's voice returned, soft and mocking, as if they were standing right behind me. "You can't leave either." I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. My hands tightened on the wheel as I floored the gas, the truck barreling down the highway at a dangerous speed. The radio crackled one last time before shutting off completely, leaving me alone with the sound of the engine and the pounding of my heart. When I finally reached Reno hours later, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, I pulled into the warehouse lot and stumbled out of the truck. My legs felt like jelly, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I avoided looking at the cab as I unloaded the cargo, half expecting to see the child's face staring back at me from the passenger seat. I never drove that route again. To this day, I don't know what I experienced on that lonely stretch of highway or why the radio seemed to carry the voices of those children. But every time I hear static on the radio, I'm reminded of their chant, their warning, and the pale, expressionless face of the child who told me I could never leave. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the roads are empty, I think I hear that melody again, faint and distorted, carried on the wind like a ghostly reminder of the night I'll never forget. Story number 3. The Procession. The snow fell thick and heavy that night, blanketing the rural backroads in an eerie silence. I had always hated driving in the snow, but my sister's urgent call for help left me no choice. She lived in a tiny, forgotten town nestled in the Pennsylvania hills, and the thought of her being stranded in the middle of a storm was enough to get me behind the wheel, nerves be damned. The clock on the dashboard read 11:37 p.m. as I navigated the winding, desolate road. My headlights cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the dense forest on either side. It was the kind of road where cell service disappeared miles ago, leaving me alone in the vast, frozen wilderness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of snow under my tires. I had driven this route countless times before, but something about that night felt different, heavier. The snow seemed thicker than usual, the darkness deeper. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the trees, fleeting shadows that danced just out of sight. I chalked it up to exhaustion and pressed on, eager to get to my sister's house and out of the storm. About 20 miles from my destination, I rounded a bend and slammed on the brakes. My car skidded slightly before coming to a halt, the headlights illuminating the scene ahead. A group of people stood in the middle of the road, their figures stark against the white backdrop. There must have been at least 20 of them, all standing perfectly still, their faces turned upward as if staring at the falling snow or the night sky beyond. For a moment, I just sat there, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't make sense. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, on a night like this? I honked the horn, the sharp sound cutting through the silence like a knife. They didn't move. Not a single one of them turned or flinched. They just stood there, statuesque and unyielding. Unease crept over me as I took in their strange appearance. They were dressed in tattered clothing, the kind that looked like it belonged to another era entirely. Long coats, wide-brimmed hats, and old-fashioned dresses hung stiffly on their frames, snow accumulating on their shoulders. Their stillness was unnatural, as if they weren't affected by the cold or the elements. I rolled down my window slightly, the icy air biting at my skin. "Hey!" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is everything okay? Do you need help?" No response. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I gripped the wheel tightly, debating my next move. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and find another route, but the thought of backtracking through miles of snow-covered roads wasn't appealing either. I honked again, longer this time, hoping to provoke some kind of reaction. Nothing. Taking a deep breath, I decided to edge the car forward, hoping the sight of the moving vehicle would prompt them to clear the way. As I slowly approached, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Their faces, pale and expressionless, were tilted toward the sky, their mouths slightly opened as if in silent prayer. Snowflakes clung to their hollow eyes and gaunt cheeks, but they didn't blink or shiver. They didn't even breathe. I stopped the car again, my fingers trembling against the wheel. "What the hell is this?" I muttered to myself, my breath fogging up the cold air inside the cabin. The scene felt surreal, like a twisted tableau pulled from a nightmare. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though their eyes were fixed upward. Gathering my courage, I decided to drive through the group. Slowly, I inched the car forward, the engine rumbling softly. My headlights illuminated their figures more clearly, revealing the weathered, dirt-streaked fabric of their clothes and the unnatural stillness of their limbs. I pressed the gas pedal lightly, my heart pounding with every inch I moved closer. Then, all at once, they moved. Every single head snapped down in unison, their faces turning toward me with an unnatural speed that made my stomach drop. Their eyes, glowing an unholy shade of red, locked onto mine. The eerie glow filled the car, reflecting off the windshield like blood-stained lights. I froze, unable to move as they stared at me, their expressions devoid of humanity. Panic surged through me, and I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun for a moment before catching traction, and the car lurched forward. As I drove through the group, they didn't step aside or flinch. Instead, they twisted their heads to follow my movement, their glowing eyes tracking me like predators watching prey. The red light of their gaze burned into my mind, a searing image that I knew would haunt me forever. The car jolted as I passed through the last of them, the figures disappearing into the rearview mirror. My hands shook violently on the wheel, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't bear to see if they were still standing there, watching me. For miles, I drove in silence, the engine's hum barely registering over the sound of my racing heartbeat. The snow began to ease, and the road ahead became clearer, but the sense of dread clung to me like a shadow. I checked the rearview mirror once, and to my relief, the road behind me was empty. But just as I began to relax, the radio crackled to life. I jumped, my eyes darting to the dashboard. The dial was set to a station I hadn't tuned to, a low, static-filled hum interspersed with faint whispers. My pulse quickened as I reached to turn it off, but before I could, a voice emerged from the static. "They never leave," it said, soft and distorted, like a child speaking through a broken speaker. I yanked my hand back, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The voice continued, repeating the phrase over and over, growing louder with each iteration. My grip on the wheel tightened as the whispers turned into laughter, a chilling sound that seemed to echo inside my skull. Suddenly, the car's interior was bathed in red light. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and my heart stopped. The figures were there, running behind the car, their glowing eyes like twin flames in the darkness. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, and inhuman, but they were fast, faster than any person should be. I floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as the car surged forward. The figures kept pace, their laughter and whispers growing louder, drowning out the sound of the wind and the tires on the road. The red light filled the cabin, and I could feel their presence pressing against me, suffocating and relentless. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the red light vanished. The laughter stopped, and the road ahead was clear. The dashboard clock read 2:13 a.m., though it felt like an eternity had passed. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking so badly I could barely put the car in park. The silence was deafening. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty road, the snow falling gently outside. The memory of those glowing eyes and that haunting laughter lingered, a scar on my mind that I knew would never fade. When I finally reached my sister's house, I didn't tell her what had happened. I couldn't find the words to describe it, and I didn't want her to think I'd lost my mind. But every time I close my eyes, I see them, those figures in the snow, their faces pale and inhuman, their eyes burning with a malevolent light. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I think I hear them, their laughter, their whispers, reminding me that they never truly leave. Story number 4. The Passenger. Driving a taxi at night is not for the faint of heart. The hours are long, the streets can be dangerous, and you never know who, or what, might step into your cab. For years, I prided myself on being the kind of driver who could handle anything. Drunks, troublemakers, even the occasional midnight philosopher, I thought I'd seen it all. But one freezing night on the outskirts of town proved me wrong. It was late December, just past midnight, and the city was wrapped in an icy chill that seeped into every corner. Business had been slow that evening, with most people staying indoors to escape the cold. I was about ready to call it a night when I spotted someone standing by the side of the road. The figure emerged from the shadows as I approached, a man, tall and thin, dressed in a dark coat that seemed too light for the weather. He was standing perfectly still, his hands shoved into his pockets, staring down the road as if waiting for something or someone. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" I asked, my breath fogging up in the freezing air. He turned to look at me, and for a moment, I hesitated. There was something off about him. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes seemed to reflect the dim glow of my headlights in an unnatural way. But then he smiled, a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Thanks." He climbed into the back seat, the faint scent of earth and pine following him. As he settled into the seat, I caught a glimpse of his hands, long, thin fingers that looked almost skeletal in the dim light. He pulled his coat tighter around him and gave me an address on the other side of town. The ride started off uneventful. The roads were nearly empty, the occasional gust of wind rattling the car windows. I tried to make small talk, but he wasn't much for conversation. His answers were brief, almost absent-minded, and eventually, I gave up, focusing instead on the road ahead. About halfway through the ride, I noticed something strange. The temperature inside the cab had dropped significantly, despite the heater running at full blast. My breath was visible again, clouding up the rearview mirror. I glanced at the passenger, but he didn't seem to notice. He just stared out the window, his expression blank, as if lost in thought. "You cold back there?" I asked, more to break the silence than anything. He didn't respond right away. Then, after a long pause, he said, "I've been colder." His voice sent a chill down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. I tried to shake off the unease and focus on the road. But the feeling lingered, growing stronger with each passing mile. There was something about him, something I couldn't put my finger on, that set me on edge. Finally, we reached the address he had given me, a small, run-down house at the edge of town. The windows were dark, the yard overgrown and covered in snow. It didn't look like anyone had lived there in years. I turned to ask if he was sure this was the right place, but he spoke first. "Wait here," he said, his tone suddenly sharper. "I'll get your money." Before I could respond, he opened the door and stepped out into the snow. I watched as he walked up to the house, his figure disappearing into the shadows. The front door creaked open, and then everything was still. I waited, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. By the 15-minute mark, I was starting to get annoyed. I honked the horn, but there was no response. The house remained dark, its windows like empty eyes staring back at me. With a sigh, I stepped out of the cab and trudged through the snow toward the house. The cold bit at my skin, the wind howling through the empty street. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time, but the silence was absolute. I turned back toward the cab, frustration bubbling into anger. "Hey!" I called out. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny." The wind carried my words away, leaving me alone in the freezing night. As I reached the car, I noticed something strange. The back door was still open, and on the seat where the passenger had been sitting was a coat, a dark, heavy coat that was now soaked in blood. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The blood was fresh, glistening in the dim glow of the streetlights. I glanced around, searching for any sign of the man, but the street was empty. The footprints he had left in the snow led to the house and stopped abruptly, as if he had vanished into thin air. A wave of panic crashed over me. I slammed the door shut and climbed back into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, not caring where I was going as long as it was far from that house. I didn't stop driving until I reached the city center, the streets alive with the comforting hum of people and lights. I parked in front of a diner and sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. The coat was still in the back seat, the blood staining the upholstery. I didn't dare touch it. The next morning, still shaken, I checked the local news. That's when I saw it, a story about a man who had died in a car accident on that same stretch of road 5 years ago. His photo was grainy, but there was no mistaking the pale face and tired smile. It was him. The man I had picked up. The man who had vanished. I sold the cab a week later. No amount of cleaning could erase the stain the coat had left behind, or the memory of that night. To this day, I don't know what I encountered on that road, but I know one thing for sure, he wasn't alive. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving home and the road is quiet, I swear I catch a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror, a pale figure sitting silently in the back seat, waiting for his next ride. Story number 5. Whispers Beneath the Ice. I've always loved driving through the Texas winter. The serene beauty of the snow-covered landscapes, the crisp air that fills the car, and the quiet solitude that comes with long, uninterrupted stretches of road, these are the things that drew me to the open highways. My old Subaru Outback, reliable and sturdy, had become an extension of myself, carrying me through countless miles of peaceful journeys. But that December night changed everything I thought I knew about driving alone in the cold. It was a particularly harsh winter evening, the kind where the sky remained stubbornly gray, and the snow fell in relentless sheets, coating everything in a thick, unforgiving layer. I was on my way home after a long shift at the warehouse, the hours dragging on as the temperature plummeted outside. The roads were slick with ice, and visibility was minimal, but I had navigated these conditions countless times before. Confidence in my driving skills kept my anxiety at bay, even as the storm raged on. Around midnight, as I was cruising down a familiar stretch of highway, I noticed something strange. The car's engine seemed to be struggling more than usual. The RPMs dropped inexplicably, and my Subaru began to slow down despite pressing the accelerator harder. At first, I thought it was just a momentary hiccup, perhaps a minor glitch in the engine management system. But as I glanced at the dashboard, the warning lights flickered ominously, signaling a more serious issue. Deciding it was best to pull over, I eased the car into the shoulder, my heart pounding with a mix of concern and frustration. The snow had piled up significantly, and the road was nearly invisible under the heavy blanket of white. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the frigid night, the cold biting at my exposed skin despite my thick winter coat. The air was eerily still, the only sound the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots and the distant howl of the wind. I walked around the car to inspect the engine, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Everything seemed normal at first glance, no obvious signs of damage or malfunction. But as I leaned closer, trying to pinpoint the source of the problem, something caught my eye. There, etched into the underside of the car, were large, unmistakable footprints leading from the driver's door to the front bumper. They were deep, as if someone had dragged their feet through the snow before making contact with the metal. My pulse quickened. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight, no one who could have made those tracks. The highway was deserted, the storm creating a barrier between me and the world beyond. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps it was a prank, someone's twisted joke played out in the dead of night. But the sheer size and clarity of the footprints left me uneasy. My mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. I decided to get back into the car and check the engine once more, hoping to identify the issue and get back on the road. As I sat down, the interior of the Subaru felt colder, the temperature dropping inexplicably despite the heat from the heater struggling to keep up. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the footwell, searching for any signs of tampering or intrusion. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible over the hum of the engine and the howling wind outside. It seemed to come from behind me, a voice so soft I almost dismissed it as a trick of the wind. "Don't check anymore." I froze, my heart racing as the words sank in. The voice was unmistakable, clear despite the distance and the noise outside. It was a warning, a plea, or perhaps a threat. My instinct screamed at me to flee, to leave the car and run back to the safety of the highway. But something held me in place, a mix of fear and curiosity that I couldn't shake. I turned slowly, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the passenger seat was empty. The whisper had vanished, leaving me with a growing sense of dread. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease, and decided to focus on the task at hand, figuring out why my car had slowed down. Maybe there was a mechanical issue I hadn't noticed, something that needed immediate attention. But as I reached down to inspect the engine, the atmosphere inside the car shifted. The temperature plummeted further, my breath visible in the dim light of the dashboard. The headlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the interior. I felt a presence, something intangible yet undeniably there, pressing down on me from the back seat. "Don't check anymore," the voice repeated, louder this time, echoing inside the confined space of the car. It was no longer a whisper but a chilling proclamation that sent shivers down my spine. Panic surged through me as I realized I wasn't alone. I attempted to start the engine, hoping to escape, but the car refused to respond, the key stuck in the ignition as if bound by some unseen force. The headlights went out, plunging me into darkness, the only light emanating from the faint glow of the dashboard warning lights. I fumbled for my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. The isolation of the storm, combined with the supernatural occurrences unfolding within my car, left me feeling utterly helpless. The footprints on the underside of the car seemed to come alive in my mind, a haunting reminder of the stranger who had marked my vehicle with their presence. Desperate and terrified, I decided to confront whatever entity was tormenting me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fear. "What do you want?" The response was immediate, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth. The car shook violently, the snow outside swirling in a frenzy as if the storm itself was reacting to the confrontation. I could feel eyes watching me, the presence growing more intense, more malevolent with each passing second. I realized then that this was no ordinary haunting. This was something ancient, something that had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The footprints were a sign, a marker left by the entity to signify its interest in me. I had unknowingly trespassed into its domain, driven by the storm's ferocity and my own vulnerability. Summoning every ounce of courage, I decided to leave the car and face the unknown. The snow was deep, making each step a struggle against the elements. As I opened the door, the cold wind hit me like a wall, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something unidentifiable but deeply unsettling. The shadows seemed to dance around me, the darkness alive with movement. I turned to leave, but the road was obscured by the blinding snow, the tunnel of white making it impossible to see more than a few meters ahead. The presence followed, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Don't check anymore." I ran, my boots crunching against the snow as I struggled to keep moving forward. The voice echoed in my mind, a relentless reminder that I couldn't escape. The storm intensified, the wind tearing at my clothes and the snow blinding my path. My lungs burned with each breath, the cold seeping into my bones, but I kept pushing, driven by sheer survival instinct. Hours seemed to pass as I navigated the endless white, the road twisting and turning with no sign of an exit. Exhaustion threatened to overtake me, but the voice continued to haunt me, a spectral guide leading me deeper into the heart of the storm. I could feel the presence behind me, its intentions unclear but undeniably sinister. Just as I was about to give up, the first light of dawn began to pierce through the storm, casting a pale glow over the landscape. The snow started to ease, the wind dying down to a gentle whisper. I stumbled upon a clearing, the road finally opening up before me, leading back to civilization. Relief washed over me as I realized I had somehow escaped the clutches of the night's terrors. Breathless and battered, I made my way home, the memories of the night etched into my mind. The car, once a symbol of independence and freedom, now stood as a reminder of the unknown forces that lurk in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. I knew I would never forget the footprints beneath my vehicle, the whispered warnings, and the relentless pursuit that had nearly claimed me. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, a lingering presence that watched from the corners of my vision. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by its fury, but the experience left me questioning the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural. I sought solace in the company of friends and family, recounting the harrowing tale with a mix of disbelief and fear. Some dismissed it as a product of exhaustion and the storm's disorienting effects, while others suggested I might have encountered something beyond their understanding. Regardless of the explanations, the truth was that I had faced something dark and inexplicable on that winter night, something that had marked me forever. Now, whenever a storm approaches, I'm reminded of that night, of the footprints beneath my car, the whispers that echoed in the darkness, and the relentless pursuit that forced me to confront the unknown. The memory serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the roads we travel hold secrets better left undiscovered, and that the shadows beneath our wheels may be watching, waiting for their next opportunity to emerge from the storm. Story number 6. Endless Tunnel. Winter in Texas had a way of transforming the landscape into a monochromatic expanse of white, where even the most familiar paths seemed alien under the relentless blanket of snow. I had always enjoyed driving through the hill country during these months, finding solace in the solitude and the rhythmic hum of my engine against the stillness of the night. But that December night was different, foreboding in a way I couldn't quite grasp until it was too late. I was heading home after a long day at work, the road slick with ice and the visibility reduced to mere meters by the blinding snowfall. My headlights pierced through the darkness, illuminating the winding roads that snaked through the hills. As I navigated a particularly sharp bend, something caught my eye, a tunnel entrance that wasn't on any of my maps. It was partially obscured by the heavy snow, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look. Curiosity piqued, I considered it a potential shortcut. The idea of shaving off even a few minutes from my drive home was tempting, especially with the storm showing no signs of abating. Without a second thought, I turned onto the unfamiliar road, the tires crunching against the fresh snow as I entered the tunnel. The interior was pitch black, the only light emanating from my headlights cutting through the gloom. The air inside was unnaturally still, the temperature dropping noticeably as I proceeded deeper. The tunnel seemed to stretch on infinitely, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I glanced at my GPS, but there was no indication of a tunnel in its database. Confusion gnawed at me, but I pressed on, driven by a mix of determination and the hope of finding a quicker route home. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. The tunnel showed no signs of an exit, no change in scenery, no flicker of city lights or familiar landmarks. The only sound was the steady beat of my heart and the distant echo of my engine. I increased my speed, hoping to reach the end sooner, but the tunnel remained unyielding, its darkness swallowing any sign of daylight. Panic began to set in as I realized I was lost. My mind raced with thoughts of getting stuck here, alone in the midst of a raging storm with no way out. I pulled over, the car skidding slightly on the icy ground as I came to a halt. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the howling wind outside and the faint drip of melting snow from the tunnel's ceiling. Breathing heavily, I stepped out of the car to get a better look around. The tunnel was deserted, the walls slick with ice and the ground uneven beneath my boots. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and made my way back to the driver's seat. As I approached, I noticed something odd, a faint, pulsating light emanating from the far end of the tunnel. It was dim, barely perceptible against the darkness, but unmistakably there. Driven by a desperate need to escape, I decided to follow the light, believing it might lead me to safety. Climbing back into the car, I started the engine and turned the wheel towards the source of the glow. The tunnel seemed to narrow as I moved forward, the light growing slightly brighter with each passing moment. My headlights now revealed strange, unidentifiable markings on the walls, symbols that sent shivers down my spine. The tunnel's atmosphere felt heavier, as if the very air was saturated with an unseen presence. I could hear faint whispers, barely audible over the sound of my engine, voices that seemed to echo my own fears and doubts. The temperature continued to drop, frost forming on the edges of my windshield despite the car's heating system working overtime. As I drove deeper, the tunnel began to curve, the path twisting in ways that defied logic. My GPS remained silent, offering no guidance or reassurance. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. 5 hours had passed since I entered the tunnel. How had time slipped away so quickly? The realization hit me hard. I had no idea how long I had been driving, and the notion of being trapped in this endless loop was terrifying. Suddenly, the car jolted violently, throwing me against my seatbelt. The engine sputtered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, hoping to call for help. The device offered no signal, the icy cold of the tunnel nullifying any chance of reaching the outside world. In the midst of my fear, I heard it, a loud thud against the side of the car, followed by a series of rapid knocks. My heart raced as I strained to see through the windshield, but the heavy snowfall obscured any view. The knocking intensified, a relentless pounding that seemed to penetrate the very metal of my vehicle. Desperate, I tried to restart the engine, slamming the accelerator down with all my might. The car roared to life, the engine humming back to life as I sped up, the tunnel stretching on endlessly before me. But no matter how fast I drove, the tunnel showed no signs of an exit. The landscape remained a never-ending corridor of darkness and snow, mocking my futile attempts to escape. Exhausted and on the brink of despair, I pulled over once more, slamming the brakes to a halt. I sat in the driver's seat, staring blankly ahead, the clock on the dashboard now showing that a total of 5 hours had elapsed since I first entered the tunnel. Confusion and fear battled within me as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I was back at the very spot where I had first turned into the tunnel, the entrance now shrouded in thick snow as if it had never been there. The realization struck me with the force of a freight train. I was caught in a time loop, a never-ending cycle of driving through this mysterious tunnel with no hope of escape. The whispers returned, louder this time, voices overlapping in a cacophony of despair and longing. Shadows seemed to dance at the edges of my vision, fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished when I turned to look. I knew I had to break the cycle, to find a way out of this perpetual nightmare. But with each attempt to drive faster, to force the tunnel to reveal its exit, I only found myself trapped deeper within its confines. The lines between reality and illusion blurred, the tunnel becoming a manifestation of my own fears and desperation. In a final act of desperation, I turned off the headlights, plunging the car into complete darkness. I sat there, heart pounding, listening to the storm rage outside and the echoes of my own thoughts. The whispers faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on me from all sides. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, and reached out to touch the steering wheel, seeking some semblance of comfort. When I opened my eyes, the tunnel was gone. The snow had ceased, and I found myself back on the familiar road, the dawn breaking on the horizon with hues of pink and orange painting the sky. Relief washed over me as I glanced at the clock. Only a few minutes had passed since I had entered the tunnel. It had been a mere moment, yet the experience felt like an eternity. Shaken but grateful to be free, I continued my drive home, the memory of the endless tunnel lingering in the back of my mind. The storm had passed, leaving behind a serene landscape that belied the horrors of the night. As I pulled into my driveway, I took a deep breath, vowing never to take my sense of direction for granted again. But even now, years later, there are nights when I find myself glancing at unfamiliar tunnels on the road, a lingering fear that the tunnel might still exist somewhere, waiting to ensnare another unsuspecting driver in its eternal loop. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I can almost hear the faint echoes of those relentless knocks, a haunting reminder of the night I was chased through a tunnel with no way out. Story number 7. Midnight Echoes. Winter in Texas was unforgiving. The night stretched long and cold, the wind howling through the barren landscape like a restless spirit. My house, an old ranch-style home perched on the outskirts of Amarillo, stood as a solitary sentinel against the relentless storm. I had moved here 2 years ago, seeking solace from the chaos of city life, embracing the isolation that only the vast Texan wilderness could offer. But that decision, once a source of comfort, would soon become my nightmare. It was a frigid December night, the kind where the air bites at your skin and the world outside is cloaked in a thick blanket of snow. I was alone, my parents away visiting relatives, leaving me to tend to the chores and keep the house running smoothly. The silence of the night was both peaceful and eerie, a dichotomy I had grown accustomed to. I was nestled in my favorite armchair, a book in hand, the fireplace casting a warm glow that danced across the room. Around midnight, my phone rang, jolting me from the tranquility. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number, one I didn't recognize. In these remote parts, unsolicited calls were rare, and I couldn't recall any reason why someone would be reaching out to me. Curious and slightly annoyed, I picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I greeted, my voice betraying a hint of fatigue. There was only silence on the other end, broken by a faint, irregular breathing that sent a chill down my spine. I frowned, waiting for something more substantial, but nothing came, just the eerie stillness of the line. Before I could ponder it further, a soft, unsettling giggle echoed through the speaker. It was a light, almost playful sound, yet it carried an undercurrent of menace that made my skin crawl. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the phone, feeling an inexplicable urge to disconnect the call. Before I could react, the line went dead. I sat there for a moment, the giggle still resonating in my ears, an echo that refused to fade. Shaking off the unease, I set the phone down, attributing the incident to a prank call or perhaps a technical glitch. After all, in the age of smartphones and caller ID, who would bother me at this hour? Deciding to brush it off, I returned to my book, trying to lose myself in its pages. But the tranquility was short-lived. Around midnight, a distant laughter began to permeate the house, originating from the basement. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but gradually grew louder, more distinct. My pulse quickened as the sound echoed through the wooden beams, bouncing off the walls with a haunting persistence. I paused, listening intently. The laughter was unmistakable, filled with a childlike glee that was out of place in the oppressive stillness of the night. My mind raced with possibilities, perhaps a neighbor's prank, or worse, someone trying to intimidate me. The thought of intruders in my sanctuary was unsettling, but reason told me to stay calm. Gathering my courage, I decided to investigate. The basement door was always a source of unease for me, its darkness a stark contrast to the well-lit rooms above. I descended the creaky wooden stairs, each step amplifying the tension that gripped me. The basement was as I remembered, a cluttered space filled with old furniture, boxes of forgotten memories, and the musty scent of dampness that seemed to cling to everything. The laughter had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement, any clue that could explain the inexplicable sound. There was nothing, no one. The only disturbance was the landline phone sitting on the far wall, its cord dangling like a lifeline to the unknown. Curiosity overpowered my fear as I approached the phone. It was an antique piece, a relic from my parents' time, rarely used in this age of digital communication. To my astonishment, the phone was ringing, its shrill tone cutting through the stillness. I reached out hesitantly, my fingers trembling as I lifted the receiver. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Again, there was nothing but silence. Just my own breath, echoing in the confined space. I placed the phone back down, my mind racing to make sense of the situation. Why was the phone ringing if no one was there? Had I missed someone in the basement? A chill swept through me as I felt an inexplicable presence, a weight that pressed down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. The temperature seemed to drop, the air growing thick with an unspoken tension. I glanced around, my eyes landing on the old mirror hanging on the wall, a gift from my parents, now tarnished with age and neglect. As I stared into the glass, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Behind me, in the reflection, stood a shadowy figure, a man, indistinct but undeniably present. His eyes were hollow, staring directly at me with an intensity that felt like he could see straight into my soul. My heart raced as I spun around, but the basement remained empty, save for me and the oppressive silence. I reached out, my hand trembling, as if to touch the figure in the mirror, but there was nothing there. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, the laughter, the ringing phone, the presence in the mirror, it was all connected, a manifestation of something beyond my understanding. Desperation clawed at me as I tried to rationalize the events. Ghost stories were for campfires and late-night conversations, not for the stark reality of my own basement. Yet, the evidence before me was undeniable. I had to confront whatever was haunting my home, to find answers before the fear consumed me entirely. Returning to the living room, I grabbed a flashlight and a sturdy chair, preparing myself for whatever lay ahead. The house felt different now, the shadows more pronounced, the silence more oppressive. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and made my way back to the basement door. As I descended once more, the air grew colder, the darkness deeper. The flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, revealing the cluttered space in sharp detail. I approached the landline phone cautiously, the chair in hand ready to defend myself against any unseen threat. Reaching the phone, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached out to lift the receiver again. The room was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I pressed the phone to my ear, my voice steady despite the fear that gripped me. "Who are you?" I demanded, the words echoing through the basement. There was a long pause, the silence stretching into an eternity. Then, a whisper barely audible, yet chilling in its clarity, replied, "Help me." A surge of adrenaline coursed through me as I grappled with the reality of the situation. A voice, a plea for help, it was as if the very walls of the house were crying out for salvation. I needed to understand who or what was reaching out, to find a way to bring peace to whatever tormented my home. Determined, I began to research the history of my house, delving into old records and local legends. What I discovered was a tale of tragedy and loss, a story of a man named Henry Lawson who had lived in the house decades ago. Henry was a recluse, known for his odd behavior and the strange noises that emanated from his home. One bitter winter night, Henry vanished without a trace, leaving behind his wife and young daughter. The community whispered about curses and restless spirits, but nothing concrete had ever been found. The more I read, the more connections I saw between Henry's disappearance and the haunting in my basement. It was as if his spirit was trapped, unable to move on, reaching out for someone to help him find peace. The final entry in his diary, found years after his disappearance, spoke of regret and a desire to reunite with his family, lost to the unforgiving winter. Armed with this knowledge, I knew what I had to do. I returned to the basement, the air thick with anticipation. Holding the flashlight high, I addressed the unseen presence. "Henry Lawson," I began, "I know you're here. I want to help you find peace. Tell me what you need." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the temperature seemed to rise slightly, the oppressive weight lifting just a fraction. I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a sign that my words were reaching him. I continued, my voice more confident. "I understand your pain. Let me help you reunite with your family." As if in response, the shadowy figure from the mirror reappeared, more defined this time. Henry's form was still ethereal, but there was a palpable sorrow in his eyes. I took a deep breath, holding my ground. What happened to your family, Henry? How can I help? The room seemed to grow warmer, the oppressive silence giving way to a fragile peace. Henry reached out, his hand passing through mine, a gesture of trust and gratitude. Images flashed before my eyes, scenes of a loving family, a snowstorm that separated them, and Henry's desperate search for his wife and daughter. Tears welled up in my eyes as I understood the depth of his sorrow. I want to help you, Henry, I said softly, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. What can I do? The room responded immediately, the air warming as the candles reignited, their flames dancing with renewed vigor. The ethereal presence of Henry appeared once more, his form clearer than ever before. He stood beside an old, dusty photograph frame, pointing towards it. I approached the frame, revealing a faded photo of Henry with his wife and daughter, smiling under the warm Texas sun. This is your family, I said gently. Let me help you find them. Henry nodded, a look of hope replacing the sorrow in his eyes. They're lost. I need to bring them home. Determined to assist, I delved deeper into Henry's past, uncovering the events leading up to his disappearance. According to his diary, Henry had been searching for his family during a severe snowstorm, his desperation growing as days turned into weeks with no sign of them. The search parties had been unsuccessful, and Henry's spirit had remained, bound to the house by his unrelenting grief. With this knowledge, I knew that to help Henry, I needed to find any remaining traces of his family. I began coordinating with local authorities and historians, piecing together the fragmented history of the Lawson family. Our efforts led us to an old, abandoned cabin deep within the woods, the last known location of Henry's family during the storm. Armed with flashlights and a sense of purpose, I ventured into the heart of the wilderness, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The cabin stood silent, its windows boarded up and the door hanging ajar, swaying gently in the cold breeze. Inside, we found remnants of a hurried departure, torn blankets, a broken photograph frame, and finally, the charred remains of a small fireplace, bearing the marks of a desperate struggle against the elements. It was a grim discovery, but a necessary one. We performed a memorial service, laying flowers and lighting candles in memory of the Lawson family. As we did, I felt a sense of closure washing over me, the oppressive weight lifting like morning fog. Returning to the cabin, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment and relief. That night, as I stood before the basement phone, the room was filled with a peaceful stillness. Henry's reflection appeared one last time, a faint smile gracing his features. "Thank you," he whispered before fading away, his spirit finally at rest. Life returned to normal in Amarillo, the haunting presence of the past no longer weighing heavily on my home. The basement remained quiet, the landline phone untouched, a testament to the closure we had achieved. I felt a sense of peace, knowing that Henry had found his way back to his family, his spirit no longer bound by sorrow. Yet, the experience left an indelible mark on me. The once serene solitude of my home was now intertwined with the echoes of the past, a constant reminder of the fragile boundary between life and death. I learned to cherish the quiet moments, understanding that every shadow and whisper held a story waiting to be told. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear a faint laughter carried by the wind, a gentle reminder that peace has been restored, but the memories linger on. In those moments, I'm grateful for the strength to confront the unknown, and for the spirits who trust us enough to seek our help in finding their way home.